Macmillan Audio presents Hello Again by Brenda Novak. Read for you by Thérèse Plummer. The psychopath and the hero may be twigs on the same genetic branch. David T. Lycan, The Antisocial Personalities. Chapter 1. We are all evil in some form or another. The Night Stalker made that statement. Although Dr. Evelyn Talbot had never interviewed Richard Ramirez personally, like she had so many other serial killers, and the opportunity was now lost to her since Ramirez died of cancer in 2013, she'd watched video footage of the interviews he'd done with others. In her opinion, he'd been pandering for the camera when he tossed out that little nugget, had been hoping to sound profound, far deeper than he actually was. She ran into that a lot. So many of the psychopaths she studied pretended to be more than they were. Most weren't smart enough to pull off the charade. Even those who'd gone years before being caught and punished for their crimes hadn't done so because of any great intelligence. Often it was sheer luck, basic survival instinct, or a lack of solid police work that got in the way. Or they looked completely benign, like Jeffrey Dahmer or Ted Bundy. But the newly convicted Lyman Bishop, the inmate she'd just met with, she found him to be far more unnerving than any of her other patients. He was brilliant and so calculating. She grimaced at the pictures in his file, which lay open at her elbow, not to mention absolutely unflinching in his brutality. They called him the Zombie Maker, and for good reason. Taking off her glasses, which she used now and then to avoid eye strain, she leaned her head on the back of her chair and stared up at the ceiling of her office. It wasn't quite lunch, and yet she felt like she'd put in a whole day. She'd been up late last night, preparing for her interview with Lyman Bishop. She had to stay one step ahead of him where and when she could, or she'd earn his contempt instead of his respect. If that happened, she might as well have him transferred somewhere else, because he'd do her no good at Hanover House. If she couldn't develop some type of rapport, she'd never learn who he really was. He'd merely toy with her. He'd probably try to do that anyway. With a sigh, she put her glasses back on and continued typing up her thoughts and impressions. Although she typically welcomed every inmate who was transferred to Hanover House upon his arrival, yesterday she'd been in Anchorage with Amarok, her boyfriend and Hilltop's only police presence, visiting his father, who was ill. Lyman Bishop had spent his first night, Sunday night, at Hanover House before she could meet him. And whether this would be good or bad in the overall scheme of things, she couldn't say. But he was everything she'd expected him to be. When I tell a new acquaintance what I do for a living, I hear the name Hannibal Lecter far more than I do BTK or John Wayne Gacy or that of any psychopath who ever really lived, she wrote. Everyone seems to associate psychopath with Silence of the Lambs. I've always eschewed that fictional representation. The men who commit murder for the sake of enjoyment are typically much more mundane. Even though I've met many dangerous men over the years, men who have committed stomach-turning atrocities, none has ever reminded me of Thomas Harris's character. Until Lyman. He's the only killer intelligent enough to elicit the association. She paused to remove her high school homecoming picture from her top drawer. Jasper Moore, her first boyfriend, smiled back at her from 21 years ago. Young, handsome, seemingly guileless, so unlikely a killer. By looking at him, no one would believe that a short time later he'd murdered her 3 best friends and tortured her for days before slitting her throat and leaving her for dead. He'd been 17, she 16. That she'd survived was nothing short of a miracle. She'd been alive to name her attacker and to say what he'd done to her.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?